My name is Robert Callahan. I am 63 years old. I live in a small town called Milford, just outside of Nashville, Tennessee. I spent 38 years of my life working as a civil engineer. I built bridges, roads, overpasses, things meant to last, things meant to hold weight, things meant to connect people. I never imagined that the one connection I cared about most, the one I spent my entire life protecting, would be the first thing to collapse. I have one daughter. Her name is Vanessa, and for most of my life, she was everything to me. I want you to remember that as I tell you this story. Because what you are about to hear is not a story about hatred. It is not a story about anger. It is a story about a father who loved too deeply, trusted too completely, and stayed silent too long. But here is what I also want you to know before we go any further. When I finally stopped being silent, everything changed. I came home from the hospital on a Tuesday morning in late October. I had been gone for 11 days. 11 days hooked to monitors, IVs, hospital blankets that smell like nothing and everything at the same time. 11 days thinking about my house, my garden, my late wife Margaret's rose bushes along the front fence that nobody had watered since I left. I came home expecting to rest. Instead, I stood on my own front porch, the porch I built with my own hands 22 years ago, and my key would not turn. I tried again, and again. The lock had been changed. I stood there in the cold October air, still weak from surgery, holding a bag with 2 days' worth of hospital medication inside it, staring at a front door I no longer had access to, and my daughter's car was parked right there in the driveway. What happened next is something I will never forget for the rest of my life. Let me take you back, because you need to understand who Vanessa was before I can explain who she became. When Margaret and I brought Vanessa home from the hospital 34 years ago, I cried. I am not ashamed to say that. I stood in the doorway of that nursery, yellow walls, white crib, and I looked at this tiny girl with her mother's nose and her grandfather's forehead, and I made a promise. I told her she would never go without. And I kept that promise. Every school play, every science fair, every heartbreak, every graduation, every late-night phone call from college when she was homesick and didn't want to admit it. I was there, every single time. When Margaret got sick and she fought hard, she fought for 4 years, Vanessa and I became a team. We took turns at the hospital. We held Margaret's hand together. We cried together. We ate bad cafeteria sandwiches at midnight together and talked about nothing just to stay awake. When Margaret passed 7 years ago, Vanessa held my hand at the funeral and whispered, "It's just us now, Dad, but we're going to be okay." I believed her. I believed every single word. After Margaret was gone, I kept the house exactly as she left it. Her reading chair by the window, her books on the shelf, her rose bushes out front that she planted the year Vanessa was born. I watered them every Saturday morning without fail. The house was paid off, fully. 31 years of mortgage payments, done. It was mine, completely and totally mine. And I thought, because I was a foolish, trusting old man, that meant it was safe. The changes in Vanessa did not happen overnight. They crept in slowly, the way cold air creeps under a door. You do not notice it at first. You just feel slightly less warm than you did before. It started about 2 years after Margaret passed. Vanessa met a man named Derek. Derek was 41 years old, twice divorced, and the kind of man who shook your hand while looking at everything in your house. The first time he came to dinner, his eyes moved around my living room like he was taking inventory. I noticed. I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself that a lot over the next 2 years. They got serious fast. Within 8 months, Vanessa told me Derek was going to move in with her at her apartment across town. Fine. That was her life. But then the questions started. Small questions at first. Dad, have you ever thought about downsizing? Dad, this house is a lot to maintain alone, isn't it? Dad, Derek knows a really good financial planner. Maybe you should talk to someone about your assets. I answered them the way a father answers uncomfortable questions from his child. Patiently, calmly, with more grace than they probably deserved. But then the questions changed. Dad, what happens to the house when you're gone? Dad, Have you updated your will since Mom passed? Dad, Derek thinks it might make more sense financially if the property was in both our names now, just to make things simpler later. And there it was. That was the first moment I felt it. Not anger, not even suspicion, just a cold, quiet sadness. Because I recognized what those questions really were. They were not questions about my well-being. They were questions about my property. 3 months before my surgery, I had a conversation with Vanessa that I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count. She came over on a Sunday. Derek waited in the car. He always waited in the car, like coming inside cost him something. Vanessa sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where she did homework as a child, and she laid her hands flat on the wood, the way people do when they are about to say something difficult. She told me the house was too big for one person. She told me that at my age, 63, which is not ancient, I want to point out, maintaining a 3-bedroom property alone was irresponsible. She used that word, irresponsible. She told me that she and Derek had spoken to a real estate agent, just to get a number, just out of curiosity. And then she slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a property valuation, printed on a real estate agency letterhead, for my house, that I owned, that her mother and I paid for together, that had her childhood bedroom inside it with the purple walls she picked out when she was 9 years old. I looked at that paper for a long time. Then I folded it neatly, slid it back across the table and said, "Thank you for the information, sweetheart. I'll think about it." She smiled. She kissed my cheek. She left. I sat at that table for 2 hours after she drove away. And for the first time in my life, I looked at my daughter, really looked at who she had become, and I did not recognize her. 6 weeks later, I had a cardiac episode. Nothing fatal. A warning, the doctors called it. A reminder from my body that it had been carrying a lot of stress and it was time to pay attention. I needed surgery. A procedure. 11 days in the hospital. I called Vanessa from the pre-op room. She came. She held my hand before they wheeled me in. She cried. I told her I loved her. She said she loved me too. She asked me, while I was lying in a hospital bed in a surgical gown, about to go under general anesthesia, she asked me one question. Dad, where do you keep the spare house key? I told her. 2nd drawer in the kitchen, under the takeout menus. She nodded. She kissed my forehead. I closed my eyes. I trusted her completely. 11 days later, Tuesday morning, late October, standing on my own front porch, key that does not turn, lock that is not mine anymore. Vanessa's car in the driveway. I knocked on my own front door. It took almost 2 full minutes before it opened. When it did, Vanessa stood there in a bathrobe I did not recognize. She had clearly been inside for some time. Behind her, I could see boxes, moving boxes, stacked in my hallway, and Derek, sitting in my late wife's reading chair, holding a cup of coffee. Vanessa looked at me, and I want to tell you that she looked ashamed. I want to tell you she looked surprised or flustered or caught off guard. She did not. She looked prepared. She said, and I need you to hear these exact words, she said, Dad, we need to talk about some practical arrangements. Practical arrangements. That is what she called it. I stood there, 63 years old, fresh from surgery, medication bag in my hand, still wearing the loose clothing the hospital sends you home in because your own clothes don't fit right after 11 days in bed. And my daughter, my only child, the girl I raised, the girl whose college tuition I paid, whose car I bought, whose first apartment deposit I covered without being asked, my daughter stood in my doorway and told me we needed to talk about practical arrangements. Derek did not stand up from the chair. He did not even look at me. I felt something shift inside my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition. I said very quietly, very calmly, Vanessa, I would like to come inside my home. She said, Dad, that's what we need to discuss. I said, I built this porch. I would like to come inside. She stepped back. Not fully, just enough. I walked past her. I looked at Derek in Margaret's chair. I looked at the boxes in the hallway. I looked at the walls of my home, the photos still there, Margaret and I on our honeymoon, Vanessa at her high school graduation, a family portrait taken the summer before everything started to unravel. And I made a decision in that moment, a quiet, certain, unshakable decision. I was not going to cry. I was not going to shout. I was not going to beg. I was going to smile, and I was going to make one phone call. But first, I needed them to believe that they had already won. I sat down at my own kitchen table, the same table where Vanessa had slid that property valuation across to me 3 months ago. I let her talk. For almost 40 minutes, I let her talk. She talked about practicality, about my age, about my health, about how the house was a burden, about how Derek, who had never once fixed a thing in his life, who I had watched avoid every difficult conversation by walking out of rooms, how Derek had connections in property management. She talked about a plan, their plan, a plan that involved me signing a document. She actually had a document that would transfer a portion of the property into a shared ownership agreement. She framed it as protection for me. She used the word security 6 times. I counted, and underneath the table, very quietly, I took out my phone, and I pressed record. Now let me tell you something important, something I had not told Vanessa, something I had not told anyone except my attorney, a man named Gerald Whitmore, who I had called 3 weeks before my surgery when those questions about the house first started feeling like something more than curiosity. Gerald had advised me to do 2 things. The first thing was to document everything. The second thing, the most important thing, was something Vanessa did not know about. Because what Vanessa did not know, could not have known, was that 7 months before my surgery, 7 months before she changed those locks, I had already done something. Something quiet, something legal, something permanent. I had placed this property into a revocable living trust. The house, my house, Margaret's house, the house with the rose bushes out front and the purple bedroom and 31 years of a paid-off mortgage, was no longer in my name alone. It was held in trust, managed by my attorney. And the terms of that trust were very, very specific. Vanessa's name was not on it. Derek's name was certainly not on it. And the lock she had changed, the door she had blocked me from, the home she was already mentally calculating the square footage of, she did not have the legal right to change a single doorknob on this property. Not one. I let her finish talking. I looked at her document, the shared ownership agreement Derek had probably found online or had drafted by someone who definitely was not a licensed attorney. I nodded. I said, "This is very thorough, Vanessa. Can I hold on to this overnight? I'd like to read it carefully." She smiled. That prepared smile again. "Of course, Dad. Take your time." I folded the document, put it in my pocket. I looked at Derek in Margaret's chair one more time. I said, "Derek, would you mind if I had some time alone in the house tonight? I'm still recovering." He looked at Vanessa. She nodded. He shrugged. They left. The moment that door closed, I called Gerald Whitmore. Gerald answered on the second ring. He always answered on the second ring. That is the kind of attorney Gerald was. I told him everything. The lock, the document, the recording on my phone, Derek in the chair, the moving boxes in my hallway. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And I will never forget this," he said. "Robert, they made this very easy for us." He explained what Vanessa had done, changing the locks, blocking entry, presenting an unauthorized ownership document, constituted an unlawful attempt to interfere with the rights of the trust. Every single action she had taken that day, and in the days before it while I was in that hospital, was documented, recorded, and now in the hands of a very experienced attorney who had been preparing for exactly this moment for 7 months. Gerald told me to get a good night's sleep. He told me he would handle everything from that point forward. He told me that by the end of the following week, Vanessa and Derek would have a very clear understanding of exactly where they stood. I hung up the phone. I walked to Margaret's reading chair, the one Derek had been sitting in, and I sat down. I looked at the rose bushes through the front window. I thought about Margaret. I thought about 38 years of building things meant to last. And for the first time since I had walked out of that hospital, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not pain, not sadness, something closer to peace. The following Thursday, Gerald sent a formal legal notice to Vanessa. It outlined the existence of the revocable living trust, the illegal lock change, the unauthorized occupancy attempt, the recorded conversation in which she had pressured a post-surgical patient to sign over property rights, and a formal demand to return all keys, remove all personal property from the premises, and have no further unauthorized contact with the property. He also included a copy of the recorded conversation. I was told that when Vanessa read the letter, she called Gerald's office 3 times in 1 hour. Gerald did not take the calls. His assistant informed her that all further communication would be handled in writing. Derek, from what I later understood, left Vanessa's apartment within 2 weeks of receiving that letter. Apparently, when there was no house to gain, Derek's interest in the relationship changed considerably. I wish I could say that surprised me. It did not. Vanessa called me 6 weeks later. It was a Sunday evening. She did not mention Derek. She did not mention the locks or the document or the property valuation she had slid across my kitchen table. She asked how I was feeling. She asked about my recovery. And then, very quietly, she asked if she could come over sometime. I thought about Margaret. I thought about the nursery with the yellow walls. I thought about the girl who held my hand at her mother's funeral and said, "It's just us now, Dad, but we're going to be okay." I said, "Yes, Vanessa, you can come over, but we are going to have a real conversation." And she said, "Yes, Dad, I know." She came the following Saturday. She sat at the kitchen table. She did not bring any documents. She did not bring Derek. She just sat there, across from me, and she cried. Not prepared crying, real crying, the kind that does not have an agenda. She said she did not know how things had gotten so far. She said Derek had convinced her that she was protecting me, that I was not capable of managing things on my own, that acting quickly was necessary. She said she had believed him because it was easier than admitting what she was really afraid of. I asked her what she was afraid of. She looked at the chair by the window, Margaret's chair. She said she was afraid of losing me the way she had lost her mother, that she had panicked, that she had made terrible decisions because she did not know how to face the possibility of being alone. I sat with that for a long time. Because I am 63 years old, and I have learned that most acts of betrayal are not born from cruelty. They are born from fear. That does not make them acceptable. It does not undo the damage, but it does make them human. I told her I forgave her. I also told her clearly, calmly, without anger, that the house was staying in the trust, that Gerald Whitmore would remain my attorney, that any future conversations about finances or property would happen with legal counsel present, and that if she ever brought a man like Derek into my home again, she would not be welcome back. She nodded. She understood. We sat together for a while after that. I made coffee. We talked about Margaret. We talked about the rose bushes, which I had finally got around to trimming. We talked about small things, quiet things, the kind of things families talk about when they are finding their way back to each other. I do not know what the future holds for Vanessa and me. Healing is slow. Trust, once it has been handled carelessly, does not simply return because someone cries at your kitchen table. But I know this. I spent 38 years building things meant to last, and I intend to keep doing exactly that. If you are watching this, and you are a parent who has felt that cold, quiet sadness when you realized someone you loved was looking at you and seeing only what you owned, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not powerless. Stay calm. Document everything. Call your attorney. And whatever you do, do not let them see you coming. Because the most powerful thing a man can do when someone underestimates him is let them keep underestimating him, right up until the moment it is too late for them to do anything about it. My name is Robert Callahan. I am 63 years old. I live in Milford, Tennessee. I built bridges for a living, and I am still standing on the porch I built with my own hands 22 years ago, holding a key that works